Secret discussions have been going on in Qatar, secret in the sense they're not being openly reported and no media pronouncements have been made. Qatar, where the senior leaders of Hamas are based, hosted spy chiefs from the US, Israel and Egypt with an aim to finding a roadmap to a truce and a possible return of around 130 Israeli hostages still held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip since the war broke out on October the 7th. Reporting everything on the ground. This one slightly more difficult to get into, but for analysis, we're joined by William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the American University in Washington, former North Africa Project Director at the International Crisis Group, and former US diplomat. William, always a pleasure to have you on the program. Before we get into the meat of the matter regarding these discussions, what's your overview about what is happening right now? Where do you think we are going in terms of the way the Middle East crisis is developing?
Well, we've had significant progress in the talks in Paris. Those are being presented to Hamas in Cairo. The Qatari delegations in Washington right now, I've been helping them with some of their visits. What we're looking at is a new ceasefire, and both Israel and Hamas have been walked back from their red lines. You know, Hamas said no deal without a full ceasefire. Israel said no pause without all the hostages back first. And they've been walked back from the red lines. And now we're looking at the aspects of the deal in phases. And first phase is kind of worked out, and the second and third phases, or however many there are still going to be discussed during the first phase. So there's been several sort of breakthroughs about the framework. We're getting closer.
In terms of what's been going on in Qatar, how do you see that developing? Clearly, at the level that we're talking about, the discussions are very secretive, obviously very much something behind closed doors. But what is your sense of what is going on there?
So it's not just Qatar. As you know, they all met over the weekend in Paris. There were talks before that in Poland. The Qatari leaders are in Washington right now. So the Qatar is just another piece of what's going on. But the ball is in Hamas courts right now because Israel, the United States, and Qatar and Egypt came up with a deal that's now being pitched to Hamas. It looks like they're going to accept some kind of deal. What was clear from the beginning is that hostages for ceasefires was never really what this was about. You may remember that the operational leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, was swapped himself along with 999 other Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier. You may remember Talit some years ago.
The
Hamas... and the Hamas fighters have always believed that each IDF hostage could be swapped for hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians. So that's what it's about in many respects. What's the formula that's going to be used for the some 7,000 Palestinian prisoners now, about 1,200 of which are being held without charges, against these 40, 50 IDF soldiers and the other hostages still in place? It will be a very different ratio than what we saw in the November 24th ceasefire, because it was women and children, and they're giving the IDF soldiers a different value here. Again, that's phase two. Phase one, they're talking about women, elderly, and injured. And again, that will have a different formula from phase two, which will be this much higher formula.
As you're explaining, and you're explaining with great clarity, but it is complicated, isn't it? This whole state of affairs, and it's very delicate indeed. And as we're talking about this, of course, bombardment continues at the Gaza Strip, presumably where these hostages are being held. So obviously, they are still very much in a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, one of the terrible ironies of this whole conflict is that the more the Americans push the Israelis to finish it, that forces the Israelis to hit harder and faster. The Americans wanted the hot phase of this war over by the end of calendar 23. Now they want it over by the end of January. That's not what the Israelis want, but the Americans did force the Israelis to a large degree into the November 24th ceasefire, and to some degree they're forcing them into this one. And as you know, the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu has been deteriorating further. You know, Netanyahu openly derides Biden and says he's not going to follow his instructions in the Israeli press when he's speaking in Hebrew, puts on different clothes, when he's talking that way. But the Americans know, and the world community knows, that it's up to the Americans to stop this war, as they did in 2021, 2014, and 2008. It was ultimately the Americans that said this got to stop.
How far would the Americans go, William, to stop the war, do you think? Withdrawal of funding, would that be possible? I mean, clearly in another conflict, Ukraine funding has been blocked in Congress. Is it possible there could be some kind of pressure brought to bear in that ilk against Israel?
Ilk, yes. So they don't have to say, they don't have to cut off the funding. They simply say, we're going to cut off the funding unless, right? So it won't get that far. Once the Americans say we're restricting arms, once the Americans say these daily shipments of arms are stopping, once the Americans say we're going to cut off your funding. I mean, we've already, you may remember, I don't know if you count the U.S. Senate, but we went from sort of 4 or 5 angry senators to 18 angry senators that are on Tim Kaine, and now we're up to about 48. I mean, we're getting to the point where Congress will restrict the weapons if Biden doesn't do it. But it's going to be up to Biden ultimately to simply tell the Israelis that's it. The hot war is over. There's another piece of this which you haven't asked about, but Netanyahu knows with a 15% approval rating and court cases pending, his political career may be over when this war is over. And that's another reason why he has a strong personal interest to keep it going for as long as possible.
William, thank you for anticipating my final question. Thank you so very much for joining us. As always, William Lawrence, former US diplomat, former North Africa project director at the International Crisis Group and professor of political science and International Affairs at the American University in Washington, D.C. William Lawrence, thank you very much indeed.